Hi, I'm Rabbi Marc Kline, Monmouth Reformed Temple. This is Shabbat Shalom with a heart-healthy dose of Torah. So I heard a story the other day, and I've heard many like it. Families that are ripped apart over the politics or the religion or the conversation today, and where you have people in those families who are so vehemently opposed to each other that it keeps everyone else from being able to have a relationship. It's not a new story. It's probably one of the oldest in history. It's one of the most prolific in literature. Of course, it's the famous Romeo and Juliet story, where our hatred for each other keep us from being able to love our own family members who want to love each other. It's crazy. It's obscene. And yet it's the world in which we live. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's home. He was, of course, saved from being drowned and was raised as Pharaoh's grandson. Grew up with a brother who was to become Pharaoh. Yes, he knew who his people were. He was raised in an Israelite home, but he never really knew what it meant to be part of his people. He just knew that they were his. And then came the day when he had to make a choice. He ended up killing a taskmaster and fled. For 40 years, he fled. 40 years in the wilderness, he finally sees God and has to figure out he has to take a stand. He has to go back and address the brother that he grew up with who is continuing to oppress his people, and he has to go to address the people that he ignored. This is a crisis for Moses, and he returns. Let my people go. And Pharaoh says no. The plagues ensue. The last plague of which, of course, death of the firstborn, came from the mouth of Pharaoh, was that edict from which Moses himself was saved. Nobody wins when oppression happens. You can have power for a short period of time, but those who live by the sword die by the sword. And no one celebrates their loss. And the oppressors are a victim of their own hate, no differently than the oppressed are victims of the oppressor. And yet God cries for everyone who suffers. It's time for us to remember that the Torah teaches us a most valuable lesson. God did not say to Moses, go to Pharaoh. He says, come into Pharaoh. Bo le Pharaoh. Come in and come into his heart. Speak to him as a brother. Try to reach out to him despite the fact that his heart was hardened. Do your best to love even in the face of adversity. I can't think of better advice for the world in which we live today. We have been ripped apart, and yet we know that there's so much more at stake, has to be more at stake, than continuing to rip at each other's throats. This is a time when we realized 4 years ago one segment of society thought an election was stolen, and 4 years later another side of society thought an election was stolen. It's time for us to realize that we're all in this together. It's not about getting what we want and screaming and taking our toys home if we don't. It's about figuring out how to share the playground, how to share our government, how to share our neighborhoods and our families. This is the ultimate message of this week's Torah portion. We've got to come back into each other's heart, not at each other. I pray that's how we speak. I pray that's how we act and how we engage. Join us tonight, 7 o'clock, monmouthreformedtemple.org, as we celebrate Shabbat and as we celebrate each other. Shabbat Shalom.